Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Beiser, and we have another developer interview lined up for today's chat. My guest is the designer over at Momoji Studios, who is currently working on the Game Fables. That will be due out very soon. This is a take off of RPG design, and he's on to discuss that, as well as I'm sure a variety of topics. So please welcome to the cast, Matt. How are you doing?
Good. How you doing, gamers?
It is great to have you on. Thank you for reaching out on Twitter. Yep, it's always great to get developers interested in coming on, and it's always interesting to reach out to developers working on upcoming titles, as well as I know you are a sole developer. Is that right?
Yeah. So I do everything myself except for the music. I hired out to a guy named Luis. He goes by LevCEGM on Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
and he does all the music for the game.
Great. So we certainly have a lot to discuss here for our chat. So since this is your first time on, I always like to ask developers, could you talk a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and for the folks watching us, what is Video Game Fables?
Yeah. So my name's Matt. I've been a gamer since I was 3 years old. My parents told me I was holding the Nintendo controller, playing Mario Brothers before I could even like my hands would barely fit on the controller.
Me
So
too.
yeah. So I'm definitely a gamer. I'm not just like a game developer. I'm a gamer as well, obviously. Uh, I haven't been making games my whole life, obviously. I didn't start that when I was 3 years old. I started that when I was around maybe 12, 13-ish. Um, I got a copy of RPG Maker from maybe not so legal means, as it wasn't even released in the US at that time. I loved it. I always wanted to make games, but I didn't think it was possible. A lot of kids, especially back before, we have all these free game development software suites for us. You think like, oh, it'd be so cool to make games, but it's just such like an impossible thing. You don't even consider it, as a reality. But once I got my hands on RPG Maker, I was like, oh, like there are tools out there and there are learning resources available where I can make games. So I started doing that. I messed around for years and years, just making terrible stuff, terrible things. Just kind of learning the ropes, like learning how to do like some writing, how to do a little bit of programming, just kind of figuring it out. And eventually I decided I'm going to sit down, I'm going to finish a game, I'm going to make a full game. So I used RPG Maker XP and I made a game called Lucid Awakening. And I finished that probably when I was I think about 18 years old or so. Um, and it's not the best game in the world, but I still like it. It's my first baby. Um, and it never really reached like very far outside the RPG Maker community. It just was known in there. I never put it on Steam, never sold it. It was just a little project on the side. After that, I got a job at a bank. That was terrible. I decided to go into doing some IT stuff on the side and doing a little bit of game development in my free time. Um, I messed around with making mobile games for a little bit. I started learning Unity through that. In the meantime, though, I was working on a sequel to Lucid Awakening, obviously called Lucid Awakening 2. That was my first like commercial game. That was the first game I put on Steam. That was like my first like I would consider that my first like real game in the sense that it broke outside of a very very small niche community. Um, and that was around I don't remember the release date. I think like 2000. Let's see, probably like 2012, something like that. It was a long time ago. Um, so I was really proud of that. It was really cool. Um, and then after that, I just dabbled around for a while. And then I got a job teaching game development at a university. I did that for about 4.5 years. In the meantime, I had started working on Video Game Fables. It started very conceptually. I would say development on that started maybe like 5 years ago,
Okay.
but that was kind of just like very casual development, like more like planning and just kind of messing around with it. It wasn't super serious at that point. But it wasn't really working out teaching. I want to do something different. My brother started a tech company down where I was from. It was about an hour and a half south of where I was living at the moment. So I decided I was going to move down there and work with him. And that also offered me a lot more free time because I could kind of make my hours with him and just work part time. Um, so then I started working hardcore on video game Fables. Then I started really developing that game, and that was maybe like 2 to 3 years ago. Um, so I've been working on it seriously for maybe about 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was conceptual a long time ago. Like I started planning it out.
Hmm.
So now it's coming up. July 15th is a release date. Um, I have an existential crisis every day about it, but I'm very excited. Uh, I would say this is like my first like big game because this is something I've made in Unity. It's not really RPG. It's not an RPG Maker game. It's something I've developed a lot of systems for myself. Developed like my own custom cutscene system where I can develop sequential cutscenes. Uh, it's my own. Everything's my own. All the assets, except for the music, obviously. But yeah, this is my first like big game. So I'm really pushing this one, really trying to market this. I'm very excited, very anxious, but very excited.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of my history.
All right. And I guess my first question for you, after all that, Matt, with your start in RPG Maker, I just want to kind of get your thoughts on using that, like on your road to being a game dev, because I've
Yeah.
spoken to some developers, and there's definitely like mixed thoughts on kind of, I guess, the utility of RPG Maker when it comes to the greater game dev space. And for people watching us who don't know what we're talking about, like there are a lot of developers who feel that the time it would take you to use RPG Maker could be spent, learning to use Unity, or like the brand of RPG Maker is kind of a harder sell outside of the RPG Maker market. And
Yeah.
like for myself, I have played a variety of games. Especially, I've gotten submissions from RPG Maker style games. One of my favorites was, I believe, Fear and Hunger, and I know there is a very healthy and vibrant community around it. But like for yourself, I guess like from what you've seen both in and outside the space, like what are your thoughts on RPG Maker?
Yeah, I think the landscape is very different now. 2000, I believe it was 2016, or no, it was before that. Maybe like 2014, Unity went free.
Hmm.
I think that was kind of Unity going free was like a gigantic shift in the entire game dev industry, in my opinion, because this was a full 3D development
Hmm.
suite that could make professional quality games that was completely free, and this was like shattering to the industry. Um, so I think RPG Maker, considering that landscape, has also shifted. I think pre Unity being free, I think RPG Maker was an incredible tool to make games. And I guess I should say this too. Nowadays, if you want to make a sprite-based RPG, you might as well just use RPG Maker.
Hmm.
Like I don't see any reason if you that's what RPG Maker is good at. So why I don't think there's any reason if you want to make a game that can be made in RPG Maker. I don't think there's really a reason to spend all that time learning something like Unity or Unreal. Um, but I think if you really want to branch out and you do think that you want to do more than what RPG Maker can offer, which I think most people probably would, I would suggest taking that time to learn a little more programming, learn something like Unity or Unreal. So like now I would say I think it's better just to go ahead and start with Unity or Unreal.
Hmm.
Before Unity was free, I would definitely say 100% just use RPG Maker. But yeah, basically, I would say learn Unity or Unreal.
Hmm.
Just pick one, flip a coin. It's not a big deal, honestly. Uh, yeah, but I think RPG Maker has lost a lot of value because there's so many resources out there.
Yeah, and I'm still hoping we get like more people or more, I guess, like non-programming based ways of making games. Like one of my favorites was, of course, Super Mario Maker. That I
Yeah.
don't really know Nintendo's like really interested in supporting that much anymore. But I do
Hmm.
think there is certainly a place for a game dev or game editing software that is on the later side. Like as you said, like something for RPG Maker.
Hmm.
If you want to make a pixel based RPG, it's
Hmm.
right there. Like the whole thing is just perfect for you. I would
Yeah.
love to see like I guess like other genres have like their own version of it. But as you said, especially what we've seen in the space with stuff like Unity, with Unreal being free, especially with Unreal, with the fact that they cut the royalty rate on that. Like there are
Hmm.
definitely more options than ever. I think for developers to get access to commercial grade engines. And I guess
Hmm.
to kind of like segue into that question for you, switching from RPG Maker to Unity, like I'm sure I have a lot of programmers and students watching this right now. What was it like, I guess, like from a programming perspective, kind of shifting from one engine to another?
Yeah. Difficult, I would say. I would say there's some that are similar. So like when you're working in the tier of like Unity and Unreal, where you're doing a lot of, C++ or C sharp, it's not really that bad to switch across things like that. But when you're shifting from something that really doesn't have a requirement for like programming to that tier where
Mm-hmm.
you're dealing with programming, that is kind of difficult at first. But I will say you might be surprised at the amount of things like an RPG maker that you gain knowledge from just using like the way you create stuff in there where you're not really programming, but you're like, making like a sequential system using like a GUI.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of things in there that you learn that do carry over to programming. So like just from doing that, I knew about conditional statements. I knew about if then statements. I knew about if then else. I knew about variables. I knew about flipping Boolean variables on and off and having conditionals based on that. I knew about having, decimal number and integer variables that you would use for these things. So, and I always told my students and stuff like programming really isn't hard. Like anyone can understand programming. It's
Mm-hmm.
not as hard as people make it. It's just actually like learning the syntax and actually learning how to write that out that you have to put some work
Yeah.
into. But, I've done like talks and stuff before where I talk to people and I'll give them more high level examples and be like, do you understand this sentence? Then you understand programming. Because it's really
Mm-hmm.
just simple logic that we do every single day of our lives. If I'm hungry, go get some food. If I have to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. You know, um, so yeah, I'd say shifting up takes more work, but shifting around between like Unity and Unreal isn't hard.
Yeah.
But I would say just don't be scared. Like it's not as bad
Mm-hmm.
as you think. It's never as bad as you think. And there's people out there who will support you, and there's a lot of resources, and um, just don't be. It's not as scary as you think, and you probably already know, especially if you're using RPG Maker. Like I said, you know a lot more about programming than you think you do. Just because you haven't hard coded or typed something out, you know a lot more than you think you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like for like myself, like my memory is horrible when it comes to syntax. Like it takes a lot for me to remember like bits of code, especially in like puzzle solving games. Like that can like drive me for a loop. But as you
Yeah.
said, the logic behind programming, that is something that you can certainly teach. It's definitely something that you can apply to many different disciplines. And it's
Hmm.
something that I use a lot when I'm like trying to analyze and break down games as well. And it is, I think, as you said, like with RPG Maker, it is a great kind of like first step, especially.
Hmm.
And I think this is something again I could rant and rave about for another hour or two about kind of building that basic understanding of what game design is, of being able
Hmm.
to put things to screen. And it's something that I talk about a lot with the design videos and interviews we do here. That getting that understanding of what game design is can be very tricky. It's not exactly a hard science, and it's not something that you can just read a book about or write something. You need to oftentimes dig into what it means to make a character and figure out, okay, is it better to give this guy a sword or have his attack be stronger, give him more health? And
Hmm.
again, like with an RPG, like RPG systems are very abstracted. They're very numbers focused. And it does give you, I think, a really solid foundation in terms of, I guess, like understanding what balance means to a game.
Yeah. One thing I would add to that too, you're talking about all these systems of design and like, what works and doesn't work. I think one thing people don't really understand is that if you're a gamer and you have critiques of existing games and you have things that you like and don't like
Mm-hmm.
or you didn't like about a game, then you're doing game design. You're saying, like, if you say, I don't like how this game did this, X, Y, and Z, but I did like how it did A, B, and C, then when you're making a game, you do the same thing. You say, this is the result I want. How do I get there? And then the math
Mm-hmm.
and stuff comes after that. That's one thing people don't realize, I think, is if you're a gamer, like, and you have critiques of games, like, then you already have the tools mentally
Mm-hmm.
to do game design as well.
Yeah. And I would also add to that that just playing a lot of video games is oftentimes not enough to kind of get you into that level of understanding game design. It really takes being able to sit down and articulate what's good, what's bad, and be able
Hmm.
to just kind of understand what is the intention of the developer. And again, like
Hmm.
between you and I bet we could have like an entire like 2 to 3 hour like a mini college course on game design right here if we're not careful.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I guess like as a point for that, like, so I'm sure someone's going to ask this. What did you exactly like teach when it came to game dev when you were at university?
Yeah, so I taught first and second level or second year courses mostly, and then I
Hmm.
did a little bit more than that sometimes, but it was usually first and second level, which I like because you're laying a foundation for them. And to me, that's really important because if you don't have a good foundation, then everything after that is kind of screwed. And like I mean, they even told me, one year they gave me like, my yearly review or whatever, and they told me that now that I've been there for a while, they saw the students coming out of there had significantly better results than before, with some of the other teachers. So that kind of reassured me that I was doing the right thing. So I tried to give them a very, very solid foundation. That was my most important thing, especially in these starter courses, like they're just learning. My philosophy when you're teaching people is assume they haven't done anything at all. Assume they've never done this before because you are going to have students in there who have never done that before. So you just kind of work based off that. So, I start with very high level concepts and teach them about logic. Like I said, for example, I would say like, okay, you already know how to do an if statement because if you're hungry, you go get food. So I would start with more like conceptual level stuff in those classes. Um, Also, one thing I did that was pretty different from a lot of, I think, the other teachers and a lot of classes in general is their tests and stuff were practical tests. I never gave a written exam. I never gave multiple choice true or false. Everything was me basically creating a test where they would use the concepts they learned so far, and I would say, here, make this. So basically, they would have like a one-page document that would say, make a game that does this, and obviously be something very simple, like make a block that moves around or something, or has a collision on it. Um, but one thing I did was when they're taking a test or an exam or whatever, they were always allowed to use their class project. They were allowed to use the internet. They were allowed to go do research. They were allowed to watch tutorials if they needed to. I said, you can do whatever you want. Like, don't talk to each other, but you can go online and get whatever resources you need because, in my opinion, I don't like to teach people based on unrealistic circumstance. I don't like to teach people based on this weird circumstance where you're on a desert island and you have to write code from scratch in the sand to get off that island. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So, like, when I'm programming after doing this for well over a decade, I always have tutorials. If I'm still looking at stuff, I always forget, like you said, I forget things in the API. I forget how to do something. I have three monitors, right? I always have like some kind of Stack Overflow question on here because I forget how to do something or I don't know how to do something or I'm like watching some tutorial for something I've never done before. So why would I not give that privilege to my students when they're learning? That doesn't make sense to me. So that's something I did that was kind of different, I think, from a lot of other teachers in a lot of classes.
Hmm.
Because I just want them to be in a real environment and see what it was really like.
Yeah. And again, like it's more important, I think, at like the start to get that foundational understanding going, because it doesn't matter if you're the best programmer, you're the best artist, if you understand what is fundamentally what goes into game design. Because I've seen, I'm sure you have as well, a lot of games from like first time people, or even people who come from a professional space into the indie dev side, and their first game is oftentimes it just doesn't feel like it's working. And I think what's very fascinating, and maybe you can kind of elaborate on this more as someone who's taught, is that I feel like a lot of like students and people learning game dev like today, or let's say in like the last 5 to 7 years, really seem to have, I think, a leg up in some respect compared to like older developers who maybe worked at like larger companies getting to the independent side. Because we've seen some very imaginative and creative games. And I've even interviewed a lot of developers who are like, yeah, this is like my first or second game. And it's like already, I think, like higher than what I would normally see from, first timers maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. So you're talking more about like the quality of them or just
Yeah,
like the creativity?
quality and creativity.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why that is. I think maybe the creativity side could just come from the fact that people are tired of the same game after 20 years of playing the same game. If I had to guess, that's probably where a lot of the creativity is coming from. I think, and I think there's some important people who've like paved the way for that too when indies started becoming big, like in the 2000s, and there were some brave people who made some very weird games that ended up becoming successful. I think people realized like, oh, I can make this weird game that no AAA company would ever let me make, and I can make this, and people are gonna like it, and people are gonna buy it. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, the creativity, I think it's just from that. I think it's just being tired of playing the same game. Like I said, a good game designer comes from a gamer. It's people are just they're tired of it. So they're like, I'm gonna make something cool that I want to play. Um, in terms of quality, I would say it's just probably because, like we've talked about, like Unity and Unreal becoming free and just all the resources out there where we have, 10 years or so of documentation and tutorials, and you have like Udemy courses and stuff like that. Like you just have all this content that you can consume and learn from. And just all these people have paved the way for developers now. I would say it's where the quality comes from.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think being able to see or just make games that you don't see from larger studios has been a very big motivator for a
Yeah.
lot of developers. And I guess I'm trying to think like if you experience this yourself or like from the other indie devs, that we're definitely in like for those people watching or listening to us right now, we're definitely entering this period where a lot of developers are emulating or recreating like early 3D. Like we're seeing this
hmm
as kind of a major trend. I was just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on kind of like how much like I guess like the style of what is an indie game has changed with like the past like 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's almost like it's just a delayed timeline, it seems to me. Because when indie games were starting off, like I said in the 2000s, they were very much like NES and SNES games, with 2D sprites. And now they're moving toward, like you said, we see a lot of like N64, PS1 style graphics. So it just kind of seems like there's just this, it's just like, hey, whatever things were like 15, 20 years ago, that's what's cool for the indie scene now. It kind of seems like it's the same linear progression in terms of graphics. What's cool, it's just a set amount behind where we are. So that's something I never really thought about much, but that is kind of interesting to think about.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not really sure why that is. I think it's just whatever is considered retro, and maybe
Hmm.
there's like this human zeitgeist that like X amount of years is considered retro. Like maybe it's 20 years, and maybe that's what it is. I'm not sure.
I guess we're all going to look forward to games like The Last of Us and Horizon being retro, I guess, in a
Yeah.
few years.
Well, I'm kind of dreading maybe like 10 years from now when we go to like the PS3, Xbox 360 era, and indie games are just gonna be boring, bland, lots of shades of brown and gray, first person shooters. So if we are following that timeline, I'm not really looking forward to that section of indies, I guess.
And then in another 10 years, the roguelikes will come back again for
Yeah,
the third
yeah,
time.
yeah. We're stuck in some kind of infinite cycle, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
So, let's talk a little bit more about video game Fables. So, for people watching us, what is the game about? Like, what's the elevator pitch?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest thing about that sets it apart, something that makes it really unique and fun, is that the game is set in an old RPG world, right? But you're not playing through that old RPG. So I think no offense to any indie devs out there, but a big problem I have with a lot of like games that are parody or satire is they rely a little too much on parody or satire, and it's kind of just like, hey, remember when you got the four crystals? You're gonna do that now, and that's the joke. And it's like, well, where's the joke though? Where's the punchline?
Hmm.
Um, or they'll like make fun of something that happened in old RPGs that wasn't cool, but then they make you do that thing. And it's kind of like that's not really a joke to me. That's not really like a punchline. It's kind of just like, here's a thing that sucks. You want to do it? It's like I don't mean any offense to people who do that, but I don't really like that personally. So I have so much trouble explaining this pitch because people just hear, oh, it's a parody of an RPG, and then it's like, oh, it's just going to be what I just described. But you're set in this old RPG world where things are very traditional, but the script gets completely screwed up due to some things at the beginning of the game, and everything goes completely off the rails. So a good example to kind of explain it is that you will see locations like that. For example, there's a desert temple, right? And this was a dungeon in this RPG in this world,
Hmm.
but you don't actually ever go to that dungeon. You go to that boss's house. You go inside his house and you talk to him and get some help from him. So yeah, it's a really lighthearted, fun RPG with big inspirations from Paper Mario, Earthbound. You know, a lot of those weird types of RPGs. It's super funny. I guess that's just my opinion, but people who have played it said it's really funny. Um, it's just a really fun time. The main characters are the princess, an NPC, and the villain's son. He's like the villain in training. So you have these three characters from diverse backgrounds, and they're trying to get things back to normal. Um, the princess, she doesn't really want to get things back to normal. She hates the script. She hates being a princess. She hates this whole thing, and it's kind of her fault. This whole thing got off the rails. The villain, he wants to get things back to normal. He just wants to stay on script, do his stuff, and just mind his business basically. And the NPC, he's basically like a big comic nerd. Think of him like a big weeb basically. He loves like the stories and the RPGs and stuff, and he's like obsessed with the heroes. He even has the helmet he wears is one he bought from HeroCon. It's one of the ones one of the heroes wore in the past. So he's just kind of along for the ride. He just loves doing this kind of stuff. He wants to be a hero. He's kind of tired of being an NPC, I guess. Um, it's pretty exciting. It's a fun time.
And I think to your point about kind of that line between a satire and just doing the same thing, that's
Yeah,
something that I think we see. I think that's definitely a misstep from a lot of developers when they're first starting out, when they're trying to say, oh, we're going to make a platformer, but it's not going to be a conventional platformer. Well, you're
yeah,
still jumping from platforms.
yeah,
A- And I think one other aspect I kind of want to get your thoughts on, especially how this relates to video game fables, is that when we see it from some developers who are emulating kind of classic designs or classic genres, they oftentimes end up making a game that it feels worse to play. That it could be a platformer, but it's not as responsive. If it's an RPG, it's even more confusing. If it's a shooter, etc. With video game fables, I guess, how are you, or in any way, are you iterating or changing the formula when it comes to the
yeah.
RPG gameplay?
Yeah, so I'm doing a ton to change that. Kind of my philosophy going into it is take things I don't like from RPGs and fix them. You know, take things that make RPGs slow or boring and make it so they're not slow and boring, right? A easy example off the bat is there's no random encounters. There's encounters you see on the map and you can avoid them, you can run away from them. You don't have to fight the battles. And that's just kind of one of examples where if it was a pure satire game, they would probably just have random encounters, and I don't really think anyone likes that. uh, I don't know if anyone really genuinely likes random encounters, and if you like it, that's fine. Just pretend you can't run away from it and just touch them, I guess. uh, and then there's stuff like the battle system. I made sure the battle system was very fast paced. Like the animations are fast and snappy. They don't take a long time. It's very rapid. Uh, Another thing is there's a timer system where you have this timer in the bottom left corner of the battle system, and it doesn't make you lose your turn if you take too long, but it rewards you if you think fast and choose your actions fast. So the higher up the timer is, it'll give you like a damage multiplier, for example. So it rewards you for like quick thinking, planning ahead, knowing what turns you're going to do next. You can look at the timeline and see like when your turn's coming up. So you have to plan ahead and just be quick with your actions. So it all feels very, very like fast and responsive. You don't just feel like you're kind of like waiting around for a turn-based battle system most of the time. There's another system that's pretty crucial to the battle system. It's called the crit system. So normally in a RPG battle, when you get a crit, I mean we all know how crits work. You get a crit, it multiplies the damage on that attack, right? How crit works in this game is it doesn't do anything to the attack that got the crit. It actually gives you a crit, which is a resource you can choose to spend later. So basically, you have about like a 40% chance of getting a crit with a basic attack. It stores up on your character's HP bar, and you see a little box there. And then what you can do is you can choose to use that on any skill or any attack you want at any point. So it's almost like a little like mini limit break that you get very, very frequently, and you can choose to use whenever you want. So that feels kind of responsive and gives you a little bit of that like dopamine hit of like, am I going to get a crit this hit? And lets you strategize with that. There's other stuff like the XP system. You don't just level up. XP is like an allocatable resource that you allocate to leveling up your party. It costs XP to equip gear. It costs XP to equip skills. And you can always unspend that if you want. So like say you got a new piece of gear, right? And you want to equip it but don't have enough XP. You could always just like level down one or two to get some of that XP back to then equip that weapon or shield or whatever. I mean, there's a lot. Like I basically, like I said, I just went into it and say, what do I not like about RPGs? Let me make me like that, you know? And like RPGs are like my favorite genre, so I'm not dissing the genre, but there's things I don't like. You know, there's things a lot of people don't like, and some people disagree me on some of those things, but that's okay, you know. But yeah, I try to make it feel fast and make it feel fun. A lot of cool, quirky, fun animations. I don't know. I just tried to make it something that I really want to play, and I do enjoy play. I've played it for hundreds, maybe thousands of hours, and I still enjoy playing it. You know, I find myself testing, and I'm just like I'll be testing a boss just to make sure things work okay, and then I'm like having fun trying to beat this boss for the 50th time. You know.
And I mean, we could certainly have a conversation about kind of figuring out what you like and what you don't like. But I think there's also a greater point about this in terms of the market for games like this, because there are certain genres like fighting games, adventure genre, that they are very adamant in terms of, I guess, what is and what isn't in that respective space. And with RPGs, it's a genre that we've seen, I think, quite a lot of malleability in terms of what you can do with it. I mean, one of the arguments we've had here is that these days, like, anything can be an RPG, or every game is an RPG in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And with, like, video game fables, and just, like, I guess, like, with showing it off to people, like, how, or is, like, have you seen, like, any feedback in terms of, you know, taking the stuff that you don't like out of the RPG, and what are their thoughts on it?
On my game specifically, or just like, I mean, I haven't really had many complaints, honestly, but I also haven't got the game out as much as I would like to, so I probably haven't gotten out to people who will find things they dislike about it. And most of the time, any feedback I've gotten from like people playing demos or Twitch streamers or whatever, I've fixed it right away. Like you said, it's very subjective, and like everyone has different opinions about every little thing inside a game. So it's kind of this balance of like, where do I change things to appeal to people, and where do I stay solid on something where it really is something I want to be part of the design or something unique about the game, even though some people won't like it. You know, it's really hard to find that balance, I think, as a game developer. Like, when am I compromising the artistic direction of this game? When am I compromising something that I do feel like makes this unique? And when do I compromise something? When do I concede and say, yeah, this probably wasn't a good choice on my end, even though I thought it was cool, because a lot of people said it wasn't cool, you know? It's always a balancing act and trying to figure out what's best for you in your game.
Yeah, because ultimately the market is going to be what dictates it. Like, at the end of the day, if everyone you show your game to says they love it, that's a good sign. If everyone you show it to says, no, we don't want this, then you can't be surprised on opening day if nobody wants to play it.
And like I said, it's such a hard thing. Like, artists understand that too, where it's like, you know, what's the balance there? Like, when are you compromising too much of yourself and your vision for something? You know, it's very hard. But I think, like you said, it's one of those situations where, you know, people will say like, oh, everyone else is crazy, not me. It's kind of like, well, like if everyone else is saying something and you're the only one saying something, maybe you should rethink what you're saying, you know?
Yep. And it is, I think, a very tough line to walk, especially when you're trying to do something different in the space in terms of what your systems are going to be. And with video game fables, in terms of, I guess, like, balance, as you say, you're going to allow people to kind of like fully respect in terms of your characters or in terms of your party. What kind of, I guess, like audience in terms of, I guess, skill level are you aiming for?
Yeah, so I think it's good for pretty much any skill level because there's a lot of systems, like, I named a few there, like the timer system, the crit system, allocating your XP, building your party. It's not necessarily like a super hard game, but there's a lot of room for like a skill ceiling in terms of like min-maxing and optimization because I love that. Like I'm a super math nerd, like stuff like Final Fantasy Tactics, like um I know it sounds silly, but Final Fantasy Record Keeper, which is a mobile game, people don't really understand how deep that game is. Like there's so much like so many layers of systems in that game. I love stuff like that. Like I love number crunching. I'll like go watch hours of build theory before I play like a new game or something. So I love that kind of stuff. So I geared this game to a point where I mean it's not as deep as something like Final Fantasy Tactics or something probably, but I geared it to a point where people who like that kind of thing, like people who like to min-max RPGs and really figure out really good strategies and stuff, there's a lot of room for that skill ceiling there. But it's also balanced to a point where even if you're not super into that, you can still get by okay, but you're probably going to struggle. I did make it more challenging than people might think for a game that looks like Paper Mario and looks pretty cute. Like people might look at this and be like, "Oh, this is going to be an easy walkthrough game where I can just button mash attack over and over again." But you absolutely cannot do that. Like even normal enemy encounters, they can really screw you over if you're not paying attention and really planning accordingly. So I would say it's a like mid to upper tier in terms of difficulty. I wouldn't say it's for like people who just want to button mash attack over and over again.
All right. Yeah, and I guess with a lot of these games, as you said, like I'm also like, a huge fan of like the heavy number crunching and trying to figure out like how to perfectly break a game in terms of that.
Yeah.
With video game Fables, in terms of I guess like the level of depth, like is this a game where you have like different classes? Is it set characters? I guess a little bit more detail on that if you could.
Yeah, so there's no classes in the game. And just kind of a side note, I love job systems. That's why Lucid Awakening 2 had a cool job system, and we could talk about that sometime. But I made sure to put like a really cool, unique job system in Lucid Awakening 2. There's no class system per se in this game. Best way to explain it, you have three characters, Aru, Nate, and Tater, right? That's your party for the whole game.
Mhm.
So there is a kind of a light class system in the weapon systems because there's 8 weapon types. Only one character can equip a weapon type at a time. So like only one person can have a sword, one person can have a hammer, and those weapon types do manipulate your stats and playstyle slightly. I wouldn't call it a class system. I would just call it like a light class system. So like for example, if you equip a hammer, your physical attack skills do more damage. If you equip a wand, your magic
Mhm.
attack skills do more damage. If you equip a bow, your skills cast 1 turn quicker. So there's like a very light class system in that sense. There's overlap between the characters' skills in the sense that each of the three characters has one physical attack skill. Each one has 2 magic attack skills, and they all have unique elements. So like Aru has lightning and ice, Nate has earth and wind, Tater has fire and water.
Mhm.
So they each have the physical attack skill, 2 magic attack skills, and they all have a unique heal skill. Aru has a direct heal, Nate has a regen, and Tater has a it's like a status effect you put on a character, and they drain HP when they attack, kind of like a blood weapon on Final Fantasy or something like
Okay.
that. So that's the overlap between them, the attack skills and a heal, right? Aside from that, though, they all have their own unique skills. So like for example, Aru has a haste spell, and she's the only one with a haste spell. Nate has a strength buff. Tater has like a magic defense down buff. Um, Aru has a skill that can steal crits from enemies. Tater has a skill that increases drop rate of loot from an enemy. So they have like that overlap. And the reason I did the attack skills and the heals as the thing that overlaps between them all
Mhm.
is that way you can choose like, okay, for this dungeon, a lot of these enemies are weak to like water, for example. So you'd want to put Tater as like your magic attacker. So you'd give him a wand, you'd give him his
Mhm.
water magic skill, and then you might have Nate as like a physical attacker. Give him a hammer, give him a physical attack skill, and then you might put Aru on like heal or support or something like that. And all the character stats are the same, so they're all equally good at attacking
Okay.
and all that. And then there's just diversity and their like unique skills and also how they heal. So it gives you room to like choose how you want to build your party depending on like the enemies, what kind of status effects they do, what their elemental weaknesses are, and stuff like that.
So it sounds like there's something some like aspects of like puzzle in like how you play
Hmm.
the game in terms of you can't just have the same party through every dungeon. Like you need to kind of mix and match their
Exactly.
abilities.
Yeah, and bosses are a big part of the game in the sense that you do really have to pay attention to bosses. Bosses are very challenging encounters. Um, so like I would say the first boss of the game, which you can play in the demo, that's the only like standard boss where there's not like some crazy mechanics going on. It's a pretty straightforward fight just to make sure the players really understand the battle system. That's kind of like the first test that do you understand this battle system? Do you understand the value of buffs and debuffs and stuff? Because like this boss, he buffs his strength and magic, and you can actually tell if he's about to use physical attack or a magic attack based on a voice cue that he does when he says a piece of dialogue when he's queuing up the
Hmm.
skill. So this kind of lets you get acquainted with the system. Let's make sure you understand like the battle system, all the core mechanics. Do you understand that buffs and debuffs are important? And that's one thing I want to do too is make buffs, debuffs, status effects important because we all hate playing Final Fantasy and trying to cast a useless poison that does 1 damage per tick and it has like a 10% chance of hitting. Like everyone hates that.
Hmm.
So like status effects hit 100% of the time. They're effective. They're potent. Buffs and debuffs are very potent and very effective. Um, but the thing about the bosses is, like I said, after that first boss, they every boss has some kind of very unique mechanic, and most of the time it's something that completely screws with the battle system in some way. So a good example is the second boss of the game. You can't hurt the boss. He's completely immortal, right? But there's actually something, I don't want to spoil it, but there's a way that you can make this platforming level appear in this boss fight. And Aru, being the rebel that she is, she actually like steps out of the battle system and she's like, "All right, guys, I'm tired of this. He's not playing fair, so we're not going to play fair either." And then a timer starts, and she actually has to do a platforming segment in the middle of this fight where she does something that makes the boss able to be hit. So stuff like that where you have to understand the core battle system, but there's
Hmm.
also going to be some layer on top of that. So you're kind of juggling this while you're also doing this. And sometimes even simultaneous. So another boss, it's a pretty standard boss fight. There's nothing too crazy about it, but you actually have someone who's helping you in the fight up on a cliff behind you, and you hold down a button to switch to his point of view, and you can swap back and forth between the battle system and him. And he's actually doing a first person shooter style thing because there are enemies coming at your characters during the battle system in real time, not based on turns, and they will do damage to you or heal the boss. So you're juggling the base battle system, but you're also swapping back to this first person shooter view where you're stopping these things from hurting your enemies because they're working in real time and you're working in turn base. So stuff like that where it's like you have to understand this battle system because you're about to do something else at the same time. So it's very challenging, and every boss has some kind of crazy, unique mechanic to it like that. So it's a lot of fun.
It sounds pretty interesting, and I do like when RPGs or when games kind of like have these like rule breaks where you have to
Hmm.
adapt to the changes at hand.
Yep.
And I think I saw on the store page that you were inspired by Undertale, right, with the game.
Yeah, so like I said before, I forgot to mention that, but I'm definitely inspired by like Paper Mario, Earthbound, Undertale, just a
Hmm.
lot of these weird RPGs that did things very differently. And I mean, you look at something like Earthbound where it's like they really did stuff differently. They did not care. They were like, we're gonna do our own thing and it's gonna be insane. Um, like example, like Earthbound Inspirations, the enemy design. Like a lot of my enemies are puns, like really cringy puns. Like there's a fencer who is a literal fence with a rapier, and he, does some on guard stuff at you. There's an accelerate, which is something that just popped in my head one time. It's a celery stalk with running shoes, and he's very hyperactive and dancing around. So it's like, yeah, a lot of like the enemy design is very Earthboundish in terms of like cringy puns. So.
Yeah, and definitely looking forward to checking out the game. And for people watching us right now, you do have a demo available, correct?
Yep, there's a free demo on there. It lets you play through all the way through the first dungeon,
Hmm.
from the very start of the game. So you play as if you're completely starting the game from scratch. You play from the very beginning of the game up through the first dungeon, the first boss. And your save data should be able to carry over to the full game as well. Um, but yes, there's a free demo out there. Uh, like I said, the game comes out July 15th, so you have plenty of time to play it before then. It's probably about, I would say, maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours of gameplay in the demo. Kind of, it can really depend on like how much you're exploring or like taking your time. But it's over an hour of gameplay for sure.
Hmm. And in terms of like the overall length of the game itself, again, you don't have to spoil things too much, but I guess do you have like an estimate of how long it will take to finish the game?
Yeah. I think it's going to be probably between 10 and 15 hours. It's a pretty short game. I'm not 100% positive because when I'm testing through it, I know exactly what to do, and sometimes I'm even doing little hacks on the side to skip stuff. Uh, but my playthroughs usually come out to about 10 hours. So I think you could expect anywhere between 10 and 15 hours, depending on how, if you're taking your time, if you're leveling up a little bit. It really just depends on your play style, but
Mhm.
definitely over 10 hours.
And I think we're seeing a lot more or a lot more consumers resonate with shorter games these days because there's just so many of
Yeah.
them being released.
Yeah. I just turned 33, so I feel like it's an age thing, but I definitely like I don't have time. The last long game I played was Persona 5, and
Ooh.
like I really enjoyed myself, but I was playing that for like 80 hours. I was ready for it to be done by the end of it, but I couldn't stop. I was like, I have to finish this now. I'm already too far in.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's nothing wrong with long games, but I think a lot of people, like you said, are resonating with shorter games, and I think it might just be because people are getting older, probably. The gaming generation from the 90s is, their parents now. They have full-time jobs. I think one thing people forget too is that I heard this like a couple years ago, and it kind of caught me off guard. Chrono Trigger is one of my favorite games, which I'm sure most people share that
Hmm.
opinion. That's not a hot take or anything. But someone mentioned that Chrono Trigger is like a short game. It's like under 15 hours to finish, and I was like, "There's no way." And then I was looking, I was like, "They're right." And I played through it somewhat recently. I was like, "This isn't a very long game, but it just feels so
Hmm.
epic in scale." And I'm assuming you've played Chrono Trigger
Oh yes.
before. Yeah, so yeah, so it's like, yeah, so I'm not pressed about length of games anymore like I used to be. I think that used to be a trend, but if someone tells me an RPG is like under 20 hours, I'm like, hell yeah, that's can't wait for that one. Yeah. And I didn't want to draw out the game and add a lot of filler. Like I was a little concerned at first when I realized it was only about a 15-hour game, but I don't want to add a bunch of filler and waste people's time.
Hmm.
A lot of good content in there. It's fast paced, so
Right. I guess another like RPG question for you regarding having fixed encounters versus random encounters. I just want to
mhm.
get your thoughts on how does that affect, I guess, the balance of your game? Because I know I have a lot of developers watching, especially people who are thinking about RPG design or making an RPG. So I just want to get your thoughts on that kind of shift in terms of the design.
Yeah, that's actually a very big topic, and I think it's something we really have to figure out as a community of like RPG developers because games were balanced based on random encounters. Like they would
Hmm.
test them and say, "This is you're going to get between 10 and 20 encounters through this dungeon. This is how much XP we need to give each enemy. This is how much gold we need to give each enemy." And when you can just skip encounters, it's like what do we do, you know? Um, I think you just have to get creative if you're not going to have random encounters. Uh, I thought about a lot during development. I changed my ideas a lot. I tried a bunch of different things. I think what works well for me is having systems outside of experience points that determine a big bulk of the quality of your party at the moment. So I think I've balanced it pretty well to a point where grinding doesn't do a lot for you, but you also need to have a pretty good level. So one system I put in place that I think really kind of balanced it out for me um, is having a minimum level requirement for equipping gear. And then what I did on top of that is the gear. gives you a significant increase to your stats as opposed to a level. So a level in this game only gives you +1 in each stat, right? So when
Mhm.
you level up, you get +1 strength, magic defense, magic defense, right? So yes, you can grind, but it's not going to do a lot for you. But you do need to be a minimum level to equip this gear that does do a lot for you. So I think that was a pretty good compromise. People could play and say this is horrible, but I think it works really well as an RPG gamer playing through my game and trying to look at it from an objective point of view. I think it works really well because you do need to make sure you do encounters and don't skip them, but you don't have to sit around and grind because grinding isn't going to do much for you. You know what I mean? So I think you have to put
Mhm.
systems outside of levels that are more effective than levels, but also implement them with the level system. That was very confusing. I apologize.
Mhm.
Another example is that in this game, you don't just get skills by leveling up, you have to craft them. And you craft them from monster parts that you get from specific monsters. So that's another way I made it so you do need to fight certain monsters to get loot from them to get skills. So that's another motivation there where you can't just skip all the fights, because you have to kill these
Mhm.
specific enemies to get loot from them to make new skills for yourself. So I think I've done pretty well in making it so the ability to skip battles isn't too detrimental to the game. But yeah, long story short, you just have to
Mhm.
be creative. That's the only solution.
Mhm. And it is such a fascinating point about some of these games, and I'm sure, like from myself, for a lot of people watching, like I'm not a huge fan of random encounters anymore in RPGs. I just find again that
Yeah,
it just pads things out way too much.
yeah.
I guess with video game Fables, you've mentioned some of the kind of like real time aspects, like the FPS kind of mini game or mini system. In
Mhm.
the actual combat itself, are there like action commands, or is that just entirely turn based?
No, so there's no action commands like I'm assuming you're talking about like Paper Mario,
Yeah.
Mario RPG, where you hit. Yeah, so there's nothing like that. There is a boss fight where you have to time your attacks at the right time to get through a shield. I don't want to say much more, but there is a point in the game where you have to be comfortable with the animations of your attacks because you have to time them correctly. But no, I was originally gonna do action commands. I actually have there's like code in there to make it work. Um, and some people might disagree with this, but I actually did end up taking them out because I wanted this to, at its core, be a solid, balanced RPG
Hmm.
in the sense of like having your level right, having your setting up a good strategy, like planning ahead of time, understanding the enemies you're encountering, understanding yourself. And for me with this game, it just didn't feel right with that system to just add that layer on top of it. Um, I think action commands are cool, but I do feel like they kind of just artificially create interaction.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't know how to say this. I don't have a problem with them at all. I think they're really cool, but I just didn't feel like it was right for my game because I wanted it to, at its core, be a good RPG. And at certain points, like you get really good at your action commands, and it's just you're just going to get the action commands 100% of the time, and then you're just balancing based on getting action commands 100% of the time. So yeah, people might disagree with me, but it just didn't feel right for this project. I don't know how to explain it besides that. It just didn't feel right for wanting to have a good core RPG underlying all these mechanics on top of it.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think people can tell when something feels like forced in a game when you're just putting it in to have it in.
Yeah.
And it's definitely one of those issues we see from developers when they're trying to fit as much into a game, and it oftentimes feels like the game is being over cluttered or it doesn't feel like everything is
Mhm.
working right. And like we said a few minutes ago, I think it's far better having more streamlined game where everything you know or everything that's in the game is firing on all cylinders, rather than just trying to fit something in because another game did it.
Yeah, yeah. Something I just thought of I should have mentioned too is that you actually queue up your turns and they go to a certain point in the timeline based
Hmm.
on the cast turns. So another reason why action commands could be sketchy is because it's easy to forget like what that character was going to do. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? Because it's not happening right away. I'm not picking skill A and then I'm doing skill A. It's like skill A is going to happen after a bunch of other characters have their turns. And also, like I said, the skill animation, like the animation in this game are very snappy and fast. So like by the time you kind of realize that, oh, skill A is happening, you might miss the action command a lot. And you could argue that would be an interesting mechanic in the sense like people would really have to pay attention. But like I said, I just didn't feel like it was right. But that is another aspect to it as well. I should have mentioned.
All right. I'm trying to think there's anything else design wise. I guess for you, anything that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to bring up?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Like I said, there's a lot of systems. Um, One thing as well is there is some things to appeal to more casual gamers. There's fishing, mining, and gardening in the
Mhm.
game. I love stuff like that. I didn't make them super crucial because I know some people don't like that. So it's one of those systems where I wanted to put them in, but I didn't want it to be like you have to do this because a lot of RPG players don't want to do it, but they do help you out. So one thing is to make new weapons, you need to use ore, right? You need to use precious gems like topaz, sapphires, emeralds, rubies, and stuff like that. You can get them from either mining, which is the obvious one. You can actually get them through fishing indirectly because you catch fish and you sell them to the seal in town, and he can trade the points for ore. So you can actually indirectly get ore from fishing.
Mhm.
You can also just grow ore in a garden, which
Mhm.
you know, I don't really have to explain that. This game is ridiculous. I don't have to explain the logic of that.
Mhm.
So you have like three different ways of getting ore. And the reason I did that is because it's like there's a good chance people are gonna like one of these three things. Worst case scenario, they don't like fishing, mining, or gardening, and they can just do one of them and get through it. It's not like a huge deal. But I gave people alternatives and options for that. So there are stuff like that that appeal to a lot of people.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's good to have like those different options. We've certainly have seen plenty of RPGs where the ultimate gear requires some kind of super esoteric. You must do 50 things exactly right. You mess up at any point, you lose out on the entire run kind
Yeah.
of design.
I don't know if you ever made any of the Ultima weapons in the Kingdom Hearts games, but that's
Mhm.
exactly what you're talking. They're a mess. I did it once, and I'll never do it again. Never. I will never do that again, ever.
All right. I think that does it for me for questions. I'm trying to think if there's anything else last minute that's popping up. We've discussed the gameplay, we've discussed kind of the design, and of course a lot of the balancing and rules. Um, yeah, I think that is it. I do have the demo that you sent over. I'll be happy to check it out once we are done. We are recording this just in time for Next Fest, so it's going to be a lot of Next Fest demos this week. But I do have your game on the list to check out. Definitely looking
Awesome.
forward to it. And I guess any final thoughts on like RPG design, video game fables, teaching, anything in general that you would like to kind of end on?
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. We talked about a lot of good stuff here. A lot of good stuff. I would say one thing about game development, if you're scared to do it, just go do it. It's not that scary. It's not that bad. And there's people out there that'll help you. So like if you want to do it or even slightly interested, just go try it. Find a tutorial and go with it. Don't overthink it and be like, I need to find which tutorial is the best. Just go find some tutorial on YouTube. You can find them for free. Just start doing something. Don't stress too much about which engine you're picking. Don't stress about what you're doing. Just go start something. That is the most crucial thing I can tell you. Just go start something. Don't overthink it.
Mm-hmm. Sound advice.
Yeah.
So, I think with that, we can end things for this chat. Matt, if you are free in the future, it'd be great to have you back on. I'm sure we can have a lot more discussions about RPGs and especially teaching
Yeah.
design as well.
Yeah, for sure. Just real quick, do you mind if I pitch all my socials and
Oh
stuff?
yeah, definitely. Feel free if people want to follow you or and all that, go
Yeah.
right ahead.
So some important information here. Video Game Fables, like I said, there is a free demo on Steam right now. Go play it. The game comes out July 15th. I'm also doing a broadcast for Steam Next Fest this Wednesday, which is June 15th. So it'll be this Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. Um, I'll be doing a stream. And then Saturday, I think at 6 p.m. Eastern, I'll also be doing another broadcast for Steam Next Fest. So come join that. I'll just be showing off gameplay. I'll be chatting with you. You can come ask me questions, chat, whatever. You can go to the Steam page and it'll actually have, there's two events on the Steam page. They'll tell you the exact times and everything in case you forget or in case I said them completely wrong, which is very possible because I have a terrible memory. But yeah, so the most important thing that you can do for a small developer like me is wish list and tell people. Like marketing is the hardest thing in the universe. I struggle so bad with it. It's so hard to get your game out there,
Hmm.
especially when there's so many games. So like you might think it's not a big deal. Like if you think this game is kind of interesting to like tell one friend or like post about it on social media, like just because you have a few followers, if you like this game and want to support me, please tell people about it. Marketing is so hard. I genuinely think if this game gets in front of people, they will love it. It's just getting it in front of people that's the hard part. So, like I said, the most important thing you can do for
Yep.
me, wish list the game on Steam. That helps the algorithm on Steam a ton. So, wish list it, play the demo, tell people about it. That's the most important thing you can do for me. You can also follow me on Twitter, Momiji Studios. I have other socials. You can find my link tree, which has all my socials on there. But yeah, play the game, wishlist it, tell your friends. That would do so much for me, and I'd really appreciate it.
Sounds good. And for people watching this recorded, I'll include links to everything down in the description, so be sure to check that out. So, I think with that, we will wrap things up for our chat. Matt, definitely best of luck with Video Game Fables, due out next month. And like I said, if you are free in the future, it'd be great to have you back on.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right. So, for everyone tuning in, we're going to end things for this week's episode. As always, do for my socials, do all the liking, subscribing, and commenting. You'll find links to my stuff, Twitter, Discord, Patreon, up in the corner of the overlay, and down below. Check out my upcoming books on design as well. So, with that said, as always, if you are a developer working on an upcoming game or someone who's interested in talking game dev and want to come on for a live or recorded cast, please reach out. I am always looking for new guests. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And until next time, take care.